It felt very strange. I did not seek or want a pardon. I am confident that there's just nothing at all that we did on the committee staff that would give rise to any sort of criminal or other exposure. So I don't know that the pardon really means much because, again, there's really nothing to pardon.
Welcome again to Chino Y Chicano. I'm Enrique Cerna, and I'm wearing my Chicano t-shirt. I hope you like it. I like it a lot. I know that I'm in violation of the Trump administration standards on DEI, but I don't care what they think. Crazy, crazy, crazy. All right, coming up, my conversation with Tim Heaphy. Tim is the author of Harbingers, what January 6th and Charlottesville reveal about rising threats to American democracy. Heaphy was the Chief Investigative Counsel of the House of Representatives Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. He also oversaw the independent investigation into the August 12, 2017 riot in Charlottesville, Virginia. Heaphy was also among those granted a preemptive pardon by former President Joe Biden because of his work on the January 6th committee. And in our conversation, he explains why he does not think the preemptive pardon was necessary, but he does think our democracy is facing a great challenge. Boy, the world is just really topsy-turvy, isn't it? Well,
Absolutely, Enrique.
I want to... Let's start before we dive into the book, just because of the current events that are happening. Let's go back to Inauguration Day, because you received a call early that morning, learning that you had that you were receiving a presidential preemptive pardon.
Yeah.
I'd never heard of that term before, but basically you're getting cover. What'd you feel about that?
Well, first of all, it wasn't even a call. I've never been called or formally notified. I saw this in the news, and there were a lot of text messages among our former January 6th committee staff going around asking, hey, does anybody know what this means? So very strangely, Enrique, I never got any official word before or since. I wasn't asked to accept or reject the pardon. It felt very strange. I did not seek or want a pardon. I am confident that there's just nothing at all that we did on the committee staff that would give rise to any sort of criminal or other exposure. So I don't know that the pardon really means much because, again, there's really nothing to pardon. It also does not preclude congressional committees from asking questions, from doing an investigation of the investigators, as they've indicated that they will do. So I don't think it will practically result in less distraction, less expense, less time having to spend responding to these inquiries. So big picture here, I don't think it has much practical effect, and I don't think it will slow down those investigations. And it was weird, Enrique, that it just dropped out of the sky without any warning.
Did you feel like if I could reject this, I would?
I mean, if I were asked, then yes, I think I would have said, no, I don't want one. It applies categorically. So it's, every member of and staff member who served the select committee was, as you said, preemptively pardoned, which will make it impossible for criminal authorities to make any criminal charges. But again, I never saw a basis for any possible criminal charges. So again, I think it's kind of an empty gesture. It was meant to provide some peace of mind or potentially stave off some criminal investigations. But I've always thought that Congress is the place where these investigations will ensue. And Congress has no authority to do anything in terms of punishment. All they can do is gather facts, educate the public, and think about legislation that could ensue from their investigations.
So let's talk about what has happened since Inauguration Day, which has been this, they've been just throwing everything in the kitchen sink with executive orders here. What do you make of what's happening? I guess the term that's been used is flooding the zone.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very robust use of executive power, even in some ways that courts have already said is improper, right? You can't ignore the plain text of the Constitution that says people born in the United States are citizens, and declare that they're not. So I expect that there has not been a careful examination of the legality of some of this, or even if there has been, they don't care. There's a political benefit to doing it, even if the acts are struck down by judicial authorities. So I'm not the right person to ask about political strategy. That I'm not very good at divining that. But it seems like a lot of this is motivated more by sort of public opinion and influencing that than it is practical change.
I still do not understand the connection between DEI and the cause of the uh, emitter collision in over Washington, D.C. That one was just, boy,
Yeah.
strange, just very strange.
Well, it's just straight up racism, right? To sort of make some assumption without evidence that there was hiring of air traffic controllers based on diversity, equity, and exclusion, that somehow they weren't qualified or they led to this accident. There's nothing there but straight up racism, and that's really discouraging.
Yeah. So let's get into the book. Let's talk about writing this book, your decision to write the book. What was your intent? What did you want to get out to the public that you felt that they really needed to understand and know?
Yeah, so I have this accidental expertise in political violence and mass demonstrations, having run an investigation of the Charlottesville events in 2017, and then been the chief investigative counsel to this Jan 6 committee. So I felt like those events really hadn't been sufficiently connected, Enrique, in the public consciousness. And I had this unique ability to kind of bring them together and talk about what they have in common, and then to zoom out from them, a more broad discussion of what they reveal about where we are. So some of it was, I just felt like I had this unique opportunity to put those events in context. And I had learned so much through my work on both investigations that I wanted to put together. And then some of it was just selfishly, it was cathartic. I just needed to kind of put it all out there, and so that I could have some mental and emotional space to move on to something else. I have ways to go in my legal career, and I kind of wanted to clear the decks a little bit for something else, whatever that might be. So there was a personal motive there in terms of putting a nice sort of exclamation point on the experience and moving forward.
So let's start
Yeah.
with Charlottesville and your participation in taking a deep dive look into what happened there.
Yeah, I live in Charlottesville, and I served as the U.S. attorney in the district that includes Charlottesville in the Obama administration. So, look, it's hard to imagine how awful that event was for us. I mean, when just imagine in your neighborhood, if all of a sudden you have hundreds of white nationalists, neo Nazis marching and chanting hateful things and carrying flags and poles and shields, it was awful. And it didn't go well. Like, it was obvious to the world that the city really wasn't prepared to protect against violence, and the speech never happened. As hateful as it was protected speech, and it didn't occur. So I knew that it was a kind of a failure, and I wanted to be part of the solution. Since I had been the U.S. attorney, I had a lot of contacts in city government and in law enforcement. So I reached out actually and offered to supervise an independent, and that's key, right? An independent review. I insisted that we have the ability to look in every drawer and talk to every person and issue a report that would be objective, not predetermined to be favorable or unfavorable. And to its credit, the city said yes. They hired me and the law firm where I then worked to do that kind of deep dive, and they gave us access to information. And we issued a report very critical of our own client, the city of Charlottesville.
That report, what were the things that really stood out in what you found?
So it was not an intelligence failure, and it was not a resource failure. So there was lots of information in advance that there were people coming determined to engage in violence. That was obvious to law enforcement planners. And there are also plenty of different agents and agencies and officers present. There were like over 700 officers from different agencies who were in and around Charlottesville. So it was neither intelligence nor resource failure. It was just an operational failure. The law enforcement looked at this as a First Amendment event. They hardened the security around this park by the Lee statue where the event was, paid no attention to the sort of ingress and egress where people would be interacting. And as a result, they just, again, horrifically failed to protect public safety. Brawls and significant Violence occurred in the streets, and officers essentially stood back. Shockingly, Enrique, the police chief's plan was to sort of let some low level violence start so that he could declare this an unlawful assembly and essentially disperse the crowd. So they didn't really even really plan to facilitate the speech. They planned to have some conditions that would allow them to say, "Hey, everybody go home." When they did that, they pushed the racist white nationalists out of the park right into the waiting arms of the counter protesters, which caused more violence, including this awful incident where a vehicle drove into a crowd, killing Heather Heyer. So it was a horribly misconceived plan, and we laid this out in great detail in the report.
It was disgusting, but also extremely sad.
Yeah, no, Enrique, you're right. There are two things there. One is the strategy among the organizers of the Unite the Right rally was to provoke violence. They wanted to have the high road of self-defense. We are just here to exercise our First Amendment rights. But when you march through a liberal college community, knowing that you will be surrounded by a much larger number of angry, anti-racist counter protesters chanting, "Jews shall not replace us," blood and soil, right? These slogans that harken back to Nazi Germany, wearing helmets and shields, you are provoking violence, and that was their strategy. And if sure enough, that's what happened. So that was an intentional plan, right, for them to provoke the violence so that they could essentially sort of initiate this racial conflict and claim that they were the victims. And then the other issue here is the use of social media to bring groups like this together. Like a lot of people with this ideology in the past were kind of huddled in their basements, as loners. But now, through the use of these algorithm-driven social media platforms, this kind of content can proliferate, and people can find each other and kind of make connections in affinity groups. So this event was essentially planned online. A lot of these people in this so-called Unite the Right event were able to connect electronically because they had similar interests, and that therefore they were given a lot of the same content, and they were able to connect with each other and organize and make plans online. That's another commonality when we get to January 6th that was very similar
Right.
to the Capitol.
Yeah, kind of the makings there. Donald Trump often talks about a deep state. Well, there's a dark deep state there. So
Yeah.
yeah. Well, let's turn now to January 6th. And much of what you kind of laid out here sounds so similar, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I was in my office in Charlottesville. I was the University of Virginia's general counsel on January 6th, and immediately, Enrique, the parallels were obvious to me. Officers in shirt sleeves standing behind bike racks, being overrun by protesters. That's exactly the same. Similarly, it was a lot of angry white guys that were not sufficiently perceived as dangerous in advance by planners. So I want, much like Charlottesville, I want it to be part of the response and the solution. And I think that response should start with facts. Let's just figure out what happened. And I was fortunate enough to be hired to be the Chief Investigative Counsel to the Select Committee to do a very similar process to what I had done in Charlottesville. Let's gather
Yeah.
the facts. Let's figure out what happened. Let's learn from that and try to issue some recommendations to make future events less likely.
Yeah, you'd had the experience before, and so many similarities if you think about it. Social media playing a huge part, the idea of coming to Washington,
Yep,
being stirred up prior to the action at the Capitol,
exactly.
and then having that happen where
Yeah,
you have a basically law enforcement that's not totally prepared to
yeah,
handle a riot like that.
yeah. And it's not the fault of the men and women on the front line. I want to be clear here. Right? In Charlottesville and at the Capitol, there are a lot of brave men and women in uniform that they were just underserved by their leadership. They were not placed in the right position. A lot of the officers in Charlottesville candidly complained to me that they were frustrated that they were not sort of prepared to do real police work and protect people because of the misconceived plan. And a lot of the folks at the Capitol bravely defended the building and defended the people in the crowd and suffered severe injuries themselves. They were also put in a horrible position by the poor planning. So this is really a sort of a large scale operational failure, not so much a failure of will on the front line.
So let's start taking a look at what you did in uh, preparing this investigation, which then is presented by this select committee by the House, and presented in a really a pretty dramatic fashion, uh, straightforward though, but compelling. So
Yeah.
how'd you go about it? Because this is not easy work, let's face it.
Yeah, it was unlike anything I'd ever done before. So Enrique, when I started working on the Jan 6 matter, I read the 9/11 Commission report, and I kind of looked at that as the gold standard of what these
Mhm.
things should be, right? A credible, nonpartisan accounting of the facts. So I assumed that what we would do is similar. We would issue a lengthy report at the end of our work, kind of laying out what we found. But my clients, the members of the select committee, I think correctly divined that America's, kind of different now than it was then in terms of how information is presented. So they decided that rather than wait until the end of the investigation to issue a lengthy written report, we should start telling the story in in little vignettes, in chapters, in subparts of the overall story, in hearings. And the hearings were not traditional congressional hearings because we weren't learning anything new during those proceedings. We were presenting subsets of our findings, and we were doing it visually. So the committee hired a man named James Goldston, who is the former president of ABC News, and James brought a whole bunch of former Nightline producers. So the hearings were put together by lawyers, me and the staff of investigators and these TV producers, and we sort of had different focus. Right, mine was always on, what are the most relevant things that these witnesses said, or the most relevant documents that help us establish facts. Whereas the TV people were always thinking about what will visually convey, what little clips or what pieces of the story will make an impression visually. So that collaboration is how we put the hearings together. They're very carefully scripted. Every single word was vetted. I was trying very hard to make sure it was all corroborated and we could stand by it. And it was timed because of television down to the minute.
That had to be a different experience for you as a lawyer, as being someone who has been a television guy in the past here. Um,
Yeah.
any misgivings or about how this would really gel or, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. We didn't always see things the same way. I mean, there were times when the TV people highlighted something that I didn't think was particularly relevant, but they thought it would resonate with an audience. And there were times where we put stuff in there that to me wasn't particularly germane to the factual narrative. I remember, for instance, there was a little clip of Josh Hawley,
Yeah.
who was, Senator Hawley, who was running through a hallway after he had kind of put his fist up to the crowd and fired them up. And I felt like that was, there essentially to sort of poke fun at him and didn't really further the narrative of what happened at the Capitol as a substantive matter. And the TV people won that argument, and they put that clip in there because they knew that part of this is it needs to be evocative and it needs to draw interest, and little moments like that did so. So it wasn't wrong. I mean, it wasn't like a misleading characterization. It just, to me, it wasn't quite as central to proving the facts of what happened.
Yeah. You saw it as unnecessary and they saw it as a
They saw it as funny,
it,
right?
it was well
Yeah,
if you looked at the way he ran and all that. But a point about Josh Hawley is that and we talked about this before where um prior to the outbreak of violence, he'd been out there in the
yeah,
crowd.
yeah. We had a really powerful piece of testimony from a Capitol Police officer, a young woman who was actually in that photograph with
Yeah,
Hawley holding his fist up, and she said that as he was moving into the building for the joint session, and he raised his fist to the crowd, that the energy in the crowd immediately changed, that they were much more angry and animated, that he actually had a hand in kind of inciting that emotion, which made his flight from the Senate chamber, by running through the
right.
hallway, even more ironic. So that to me, like her testimony about the reaction of the crowd was centrally relevant to what happened, much more so than him jogging across the hallway.
Yeah. Is that someone that you interviewed? They did on camera as well?
Yes. I mean, actually, I don't know if she was on camera or if
Yeah.
that was just one that not every single one was on camera. Most of them
Yeah.
were, but some of the law enforcement people actually did not want to have their testimony made public or did not want to testify in the hearing. A lot of them, Enrique, are still on the Capitol Police Force, and I think they don't want to be famous. They don't want to be testifying or have their interviews played in a congressional hearing, and we tried to respect that.
Right. Because they become a target and continue to be. So that would make it
Right.
that much more difficult.
Yep.
So as you are preparing all of this, you have to do interviews with a number of people that had been in the Trump administration. So tell me about and the folks that you talked to, and really probably one of the bigger interviews that you had to do was Bill Barr.
Yeah. Yeah. So the people in the room where it happened here were all members of the Trump administration, the Trump campaign, even the president's family, the witnesses, the people with really the knowledge that we needed were all part of that administration. So we reached out to them. Some of them invoked an executive privilege and wouldn't speak to us. We had an early legal dispute with Steve Bannon, right? We subpoenaed him. He said, "Nope, I'm not coming. I have an executive privilege." We submitted him to Congress. I mean, to the Justice Department that he should be charged with contempt of Congress, and he was found guilty and actually went to prison for that. Others, though, were amenable to coming in. Bill Barr is one of those people, and luckily, Enrique, there were a lot of former administration officials who were in the Bill Barr camp and decided to cooperate with the committee, and gave us really important testimony. Attorney General Barr was crucial because he tasked the FBI and federal prosecutors around the country with looking closely at all of these claims of election fraud. And he was able to say that after they looked into them, that they weren't credible. And he told the president directly multiple times, there is no evidence of systemic election fraud sufficient to undermine the outcome. What you are telling the public about the election being stolen is not accurate. And that was important for us to establish the president's state of mind. Barr's repeated explanation to him, and he told us this on the record, on camera. And it was a really important moment for the investigation. And it also potentially led other people who were in the administration. It sort of gave us credibility that we had a witness like Barr, early, willing to go on the record.
Did you have to gear yourself up for that, or because I mean, the figure that he has been and always came off as a pretty gruff guy, and
Yeah.
and I'm sure you had to deal with a lot of witnesses or in your line of work that were not the easiest people to talk to.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was a U.S. attorney, and I worked for Eric Holder, who was U.S. attorney, and Eric and Attorney General Barr had very different approaches to the job. I read Attorney General Barr's book in preparation for my interview of him, and a lot of it included sort of policy ideas with which I strongly disagreed. I thought, for example, his aggressive enforcement of immigration laws, his criticism of the Mueller investigation, he was not very focused on crime prevention or reentry. A lot of the things very different on the merits of justice policy from what Attorney General Holder. But none of that mattered. Like, even though he and I disagreed probably on political issues, the task at hand was what happened before January 6th. And he, to his credit, Enrique, when he decided to do this, it was not difficult to pull out information from him. A lot of other interviewees were, right? It was very hard to kind of coax them to begrudgingly give us pieces of the story. That's often the case when you interview reluctant witnesses. Barr, I kind of said what happened, press play, and he was off and running. It was not, he was pretty affirmative that he was going to do this and tell the truth. So it wasn't a hard interview,
Right.
even though a lot of what he had done as a lawyer in the past was, different than the things that I would have done.
Who was really difficult?
I would probably say that Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner. were difficult. And when I say difficult, I don't want to suggest that they were doing anything improper, but they were really reluctant to say things that they knew would potentially be negative toward, their father or father-in-law. Ivanka, for example, would say, we were preparing to move to Florida in November after the election. We knew that the election, that he had lost. She said she credited Bill Barr and the DOJ investigations. She did talk about the day of January 6th in the Capitol and her efforts to try to get her father to issue some sort of statement. But she was very careful. She was very thoughtful and meticulous in her answers and was trying very hard to answer the question without providing broader color or anything beyond the specific question that would hurt her father. Jared, similarly, I was very focused, Tim, on, Mideast peace. And we knew that we only had a couple of weeks left. And I wasn't particularly focused on the election. And the sort of the failure to recollect some things, I think they probably could have given us a bit more. But they're both smart and careful. And so that's very different from Bill Barr, right? We're with them, it was like every single grudging admission we had to coax out over the course of time. Barr, he was off and running.
Well, I imagine you wanted to talk to Trump.
Yes, we subpoenaed him and he refused to comply.
Anybody else that you really wanted to talk to, but you weren't able to talk to, or that you were able to talk to that, it was hard to get them there, but they finally showed up?
So on that last question, Pat Cipollone, there was a lot of back and forth with Pat. He was the White House counsel, and he believed strongly that there needed to be some institutional prerogative that the White House counsel should not have to disclose to Congress the confidential information that he provides to the president. And we respected that and negotiated with him and his lawyer about, okay, we won't ask you about direct communications you had with the president, but there's a lot beyond that we think is relevant and not privileged. And he came along and actually sat for a day-long interview and gave us some very important information. So the kind of negotiation with Cipollone and accommodating to some extent his assertion of attorney-client privilege, but him also giving us important information, that was huge. Frustrating that we did not interview either President Trump or Vice President Pence, right? Mm-hmm. With Trump, we subpoenaed him and he didn't come. Vice President Pence, there was a lot of back and forth with his counsel and discussion about what would be permissible and what would not. We could never actually reach an agreement, so we were not able to interview Vice President Pence. Now, he did write a book and he did make a lot of public statements about what happened. We interviewed his chief of staff. We interviewed his general counsel. So we had a really clear picture about the vice president's actions and what pressure was put on him. So I don't think that was a big hole in terms of telling the story, but it certainly would have been better to hear from him personally.
What about Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman, who'd been,
we did interview both. John Eastman asserted a Fifth Amendment privilege to everything, provided no information. And I think that was a legitimate assertion. I do think he's been subsequently charged criminally in Georgia. He's listed as an unnamed co-conspirator in the federal indictment the special counsel brought. So I do think he had some criminal exposure. Giuliani did testify to certain questions. He asserted an executive or an attorney-client privilege, but he also, expounded at length about the good faith efforts to investigate election fraud. I mean, his narrative with us continued to be there were serious concerns about the election, that he was legitimately evaluating, that his statements were not reckless because there was some indication that those theories were true. He essentially sort of doubled down on the stories that he had told publicly.
Talk about the members of the committee. Liz Cheney. Talk about that working relationship that you ended up having with them, and what was that like?
Yeah, Ms. Cheney is incredibly smart. She's a really good lawyer, and she was very involved day to day in the investigation. I used to joke with her that we should get her a desk in our staff office because she was so immersed in the facts. The typical congressional investigation, the staff kind of does the fact gathering, presents raw material to the members who then asked questions about it or presented at hearings. This was very different. Our members, not just Ms. Cheney, but a lot of them were directly involved in questioning witnesses, would show up at interviews. Sometimes we would be in a conference room where I would be across the table from the witness, but some of the members of the committee were participating via Zoom. And the cue for me was if a member turned on his or her camera, that meant that they had a question. So I would stop and I would say, Ms. Lofgren, do you have a question? And she would jump in. Mr. Schiff, do you have something to add? And he would jump in. So the members were really vitally involved, Enrique, in actually turning the wheels of the investigation. Four of them were lawyers. Ms. Cheney, Mr. Raskin, Mr. Schiff, and Ms. Lofgren are all really, and even the non-lawyers were really directly involved and added real value. So they paid close attention. I briefed them every week as to what we were learning. They asked really good questions. So this was a roll up your sleeves kind of committee, and I give them a lot of credit for the time they spent and the value they added.
You had a really tight timeline with all of this, which
We did.
meant it had to be intense pressure.
Yeah, we were going to expire at the end of the Congress. So we knew when we started that we had 16 months or so. I started in August of 21, and the end of the following year of 22 was when Congress would expire. So yes, that meant that we had to make hard choices about how to spend our time. We could not pursue every lead, every person. So we made daily decisions about, is this significant enough for us to spend time? We also had to work closely together. So, we had an investigative staff of 20, 25 lawyers. They were broken up into different teams. So we had to ensure that the teams were coordinating, that we weren't duplicating efforts. We were sharing information internally effectively so that everyone was aware of what we were learning. Like, it was essential that our process was efficient given the limited amount of time.
This became must-see TV. I mean, it was so different, and I think partly because of the presentation was not just a dry
Yeah.
committee meeting or hearing, but you also had the television elements to it. You had the testimony from people that had been impacted, the law enforcement officials that had been attacked, others who had, their lives were changed and damaged in some respect just for doing their jobs. As you were watching this unfold and hearing about the number of people that were tuning in and watching, how'd you feel about that?
Yeah, I felt like it was working. If part of the goal of the committee is to educate the public, to bring these facts to light, I started to realize pretty quickly that these televised hearings were doing that. They were first of all factually accurate. That was my focus all along. I wanted to ensure that there was nothing in any of the hearings that anyone could sort of factually question. Because in my experience, Enrique, and most of my career has been as a prosecutor, if you put into an evidentiary presentation anything at all that remotely causes doubt, it infects the entire presentation. So I was meticulous about ensuring every word was corroborated, we could stand behind confidently. And the hearings, I think, did that. And the response to the visual presentation was really enthusiastic, or enthusiastic in terms of viewership. Not everyone was happy with what they saw. I don't mean to suggest that, but people were watching, and that was important to us. No question. Part of the goal here was to gather the facts and put them back out into the public because they were so significant. So I felt pretty early like, yeah, this makes sense. This works. That we are landing here, like we are saying things that are getting through to America, and that it's important for the historical record, both short and long term.
There was a connection if you look at the way things transpired between what happened in Charlottesville and the kind of the way things played out, and very similar to what happened on January 6th. So in writing the book, what were you hoping to get? You want the reader and the public to understand about these connections and what we should be concerned about, and for the sake of our democracy.
Yeah. So the big connection, aside from the law enforcement stuff and the social media stuff, to me, they both events reveal To me, the fundamental divide in America is not any longer between right and left, but it's rather between those who believe in institutions and those who do not, those who think those institutions no longer work or serve them. Like both Charlottesville and January 6th, Enrique, started as events focused on a core issue, right? Charlottesville, it was Civil War statues. Pretty quickly, it became a broad forum for anger at a liberal college government, college town government that is trying to erase history, and a broadly, government that doesn't serve the white nationalist ideology of the people who came. The Capitol started as an event about the election. A lot of people were there because they thought the election was stolen, but there are a lot of people there who were angry at government for COVID restrictions or for the same reasons that folks in Charlottesville were angry, that the perception that government is prioritizing other things, no longer their interests. So both of them are just broad forums for anger at government and other institutions. And that to me was really, really instructive. That's the core divide that we face in this country. There are a lot more people who just don't believe that the federal government works for them, who don't believe the mass media, who don't believe that higher education is there to pursue the truth, who even don't believe in science. That's broader and deeper than I appreciated. And then there are a lot of other people, and I'm in this latter category, that kind of trust those institutions. So that the main thesis of the book is that that is what we are dealing with. And then the book goes on to talk about sort of how we should respond to that. But we should start by recognition that there's this sort of insider-outsider divide in America.
So how should we respond?
Well, we shouldn't wait for government to do it. I don't believe that government will heal itself. I don't believe that our elected officials, candidly, are addressing the real problems, and that's what fuels the cynicism. The way that our elected officials, particularly in the legislatures, both federal and state, their priority is on incumbency protection. The way districts are gerrymandered and special interest money flows in, there's very little incentive to compromise and come up with constructive solutions by listening to the other side. So the first point is, don't wait for some cavalry to come in from the outside and fix this. We collectively, the American people, have to fix it. And the first thing we have to do is care, Enrique. I worry more about apathy in this country than I do anger, right? Cynicism could fuel one or the other at the Capitol and in Charlottesville. That angered institutions created these spasms of violence. But I fear that a lot of other people in this country don't get mad. They just stay home. They don't vote. They don't educate themselves. They don't engage with each other. They withdraw from civic life. That is a bigger threat to democracy in my mind than anger, and that's what we have to counteract.
Yeah, I agree with that, because leading up to the election, and I think all elections, I think, for me, participation in this is so critical, even if it's the
Yeah,
smallest issue. But you often hear so much these days from people, well, my vote does not count.
right. Yeah, that's crazy. Like 66% of registered voters voted in the presidential election. So fully a third of Americans who'd registered didn't think their vote mattered. And that doesn't even count all of the people that could have registered, adults in America that didn't. So when you don't participate, you are giving outsized authority to people who don't necessarily, have mainstream views, or who have views they're given outsized power because the fewer people are counteracting them. I have no concern about democracy, Enrique. If everybody in America votes, if everybody in America participates, I have a lot of faith in the common sense of people, but too many people don't. And that is where I worry that gives lots of other people who don't have as much common sense a lot more authority. Their voice is louder.
And I think we have other factors that have really come into play here is social media. As you pointed out, that
Yeah.
really helped to stir up the anger and the division, I'd say, on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely. That is not a partisan phenomenon. There's a lot of misinformation that proliferates on social media platforms, and a lot of people get their information exclusively through links in their curated, algorithm-driven social media feed. We need to be aware of that ecosystem. Social media platforms are not newspapers. They're not held to the same legal standard as the New York Times or CBS News. They are bulletin boards where people can post whatever, and there's very little content moderation, and false information therefore proliferates, and people get pushed to them things that are designed to keep them engaged and reinforce things that they had read or things that they had interacted with before. That's an information ecosystem that we have to understand. We have to help navigate. We have to help our children in particular navigate, because it allows people to go down these rabbit holes. There are a lot of people at the Capitol that, because of their consumption of information through those social media platforms, sincerely but misguidedly believed that the election was stolen. So that misinformation really causes damage if we don't recognize it and counteract it.
Well, it doesn't help when you have Facebook and uh, it's the guy that founded it, Mark Zuckerberg, say we're not going to fact check anymore, and
Yeah,
others
yeah,
pulling back on these things as well. It only
yeah,
just makes it worse. So yeah, okay. So back to inauguration day again, and an executive order pardoning all those that had been arrested and sent to prison for their actions on January 6th. That
yeah.
that had to be a gut punch for you.
Yeah, it was horribly disappointing, Enrique. Look, I believe that criminal punishment deters bad behavior. That when the system can hold accountable people for their mistakes, that makes future mistakes by others less likely. And if you believe that, as I do, then the excuse of criminal conduct, the explicit pardoning of it, then you arguably encourage it. So my fear, A, is that those individuals who have been pardoned feel as if they have this sort of blank check backstop from the White House, which could embolden them to engage in more similar acts of violence and others beyond them. It just sort of sends the message that you can get away with acts of violence. I thought that the president might draw some line between misdemeanants who were charged with trespassing versus violent offenders that are convicted of or pled guilty to assaulting police. He did not. He essentially put them all in the same category, which was surprising and really disappointing. And it's been criticized by Republican members of Congress and some, of the president's own nominees for particular jobs. So I hope that people are paying attention to this. I hope that it creates more of a backlash. Again, it's one of those things that I hope gets people's attention and gets them to participate, because that's what we need in this country is engagement and participation. And maybe things like a blanket pardon for violent criminals is part of the impetus that gets people to pay attention.
So looking back now for the work that you did in both of these events from Charlottesville, but then later on for the January 6th committee, I'm just wondering, particularly January 6th, so much that was brought out there, and yet Donald Trump is elected again. Uh, is that troubling to you?
It doesn't diminish the work that we did. That I want to be clear. The reason that I joined this effort was that I wanted to be part of a group that established the definitive historical account of what happened on that awful day. And even if the short term political benefit has been diminished by the former president returning to office, the long term benefit of the legacy, of the history, of the story we told, which I think will stand up well to the test of scrutiny, made it worth it. So I've been asked this, like, well, does the president getting reelected mean that the work you did was for nothing? No, absolutely not. The work we did matters and will matter historically. Again, I think it's that you can't really explain the president's victory by any one factor. There are a lot of things that informed it. But I really believe there are a lot of people that voted for President Trump that agree with his partial responsibility for January 6th, but they just are so cynical about government that they want a change agent. It's more important for them to have a disruptor in the White House than it is they don't necessarily endorse his character or his morality, but they want the change that he has run on. And that it just reinforces my view that there's this deep undercurrent of cynicism in this country, so much so that they're willing to put somebody in the White House who they think might, in fact, have have been involved in inciting an insurrection.
As we close here, last word about really, because we're talking about trying to maintain our democracy. And right now we're in a tug of war about all of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Democracy comes down to us, comes down to people. And what I say in the book is that it really has to be sort of bottom up and organic. Every person needs to take responsibility to do his or her part to preserve democracy. And that means educating yourself, ensuring that you're getting balanced perspectives and you're resistant to these rabbit holes of misinformation. It involves having the courage to have conversations with people who are different from you, not just demonizing someone who voted for another candidate, finding ways to engage, looking for shared experience. We're more alike in this country, Enrique, regardless of politics, than we are different. And we have to find ways to get back to remembering that. So if everybody takes that seriously and votes, again, participates in civic life and votes, if everybody takes their own responsibility seriously, we're good, right? We're going to be fine. Counteracting that apathy and getting everybody to personally take responsibility, to me, that's the key going forward. If we do that, we're going to be okay, regardless of who's president.
Tim Heaphy is the author of Harbingers, what January 6th and Charlottesville reveal about the rising threats to American democracy. Hey, thank you so much for taking the time, Tim, to talk to me and to lay out, I think, what's really vital concerns that we should all have, and we got work to do.
We do. Enrique, I really appreciate your interest and your willingness to talk about these issues. Like you said, we got work to do, and the first step is kind of flagging where we are and understanding it. So thanks for giving me the opportunity.
You bet. Thank you.
Yeah.
The Chino Y Chicano podcast is available on your favorite podcast provider.
You can watch the video version on YouTube, and Converge Media, a leading producer of culturally relevant content in the Pacific Northwest. We'll talk more later.